The opposition of President Nicolas Maduro said more than 7 million Venezuelans have cast their symbolic votes rejecting his plan to rewrite the Constitution. In this debate, we're going to ask, was this a strong showing or was it not that convincing? We'll be looking at how the opposition will be facing tough choices 2 weeks before Maduro seeks to reshape the political system. Let's bring on our correspondent Jesus Silva, who joins us from Caracas, to tell us first more about this vote that took place. Jesus Silva, we know at this point roughly 7 million or a little over that came out to vote. What does that show in terms of the showing? And of course, tell us how that went overall.
There are certainly mixed emotions in the political landscape of Venezuela. On one side, the opposition leaders promised that they would obtain 10 million people voting in favor of their consult for this election that they normally had yesterday. But despite this wasn't an official election, the number that was promised was not obtained. They spoke about 10 million, they only got 7 million. Experts say that this might be considered as not satisfying as a result, because to defeat the ruling party of President Nicolas Maduro, maybe there is a need of 8 million voters to produce a majority. However, considering the fact that there have been several weeks and months of violence in Venezuela, for some people, such figures, 7 million people, represent satisfaction and a mission accomplished for the opposition. On the other hand, we have the reactions of the government. They say that the election rehearsal that they held yesterday was really successful. Many people were seen in the street voting these polling stations, casting their votes in this rehearsal. So according to the statement by the top authorities of the ruling party, there was a similar quantity amount of people that was seen in the case of the opposition. They expressed satisfaction with this preliminary result in the rehearsal, and they look forward to achieving and garnering even more support for the upcoming election next July 30th.
Thank you for that. Jesus Silva, correspondent from Caracas. Now let's bring some analysis into the picture. Latin American affairs expert Javier Farja joins us from London. And we have political commentator and analyst Jason Unruhe, who joins us from Ontario. Gentlemen, welcome. Jason Unruhe, let me start with you and tell us what you think about the 7 million votes that came out, although it's symbolic. According to our correspondent there from Caracas, he said that some analysts think that that fell short of the expectations at a minimum from the opposition.
Well, I think it does definitely fall short of the expectations. One of the things that the Maduro government has always tried to put an emphasis on was the democratic legitimacy of the government. And when you have a collection of people trying so hard to fight against that, especially with the image that they particularly try to project, that nobody likes this government, that it's a hell on earth and everybody hates it, to collect these kinds of numbers and not get a majority that you would be looking for, it certainly does contradict kind of the mainstream narrative that we get. In a full participatory democracy, you would think that the numbers would be much higher. But this does certainly indicate that Venezuela is deeply divided politically, although not everyone agrees that the government should be dissolved. Many people have their own views of how things should be, but in the end, it does fall short.
Well, let's see if our guest Javier Farja agrees. Do you agree with that assessment? I mean, we're looking at out of 31 million people, for a little over 7 million to have come out. Comparatively, 7.7 million vote was what came out back in the 2015 legislative elections. How do you see the number of people that came out, Javier Farja?
That's correct. I didn't have the chance to hear everything that the colleague said in Toronto, so I'll assume that he's sort of agreeing with it. Yes, I mean, it's around 20 to 21 million people are registered to vote or are allowed to vote. But it means that a third of those people turn up to this sort of polls. By the way, that's what the opposition says, that 7 million people turn up. We don't really know if that is the case. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that it is the case, although there's no scientific way to assess, that that's actually the case. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that 7 million people turn up. It's barely a third of the electorate. Not only that, at the same time, there were some essays, some practices for the for the Constituent Assembly vote in rehearsals for the 30th of July. So it's falls really, really short of the expectations the opposition have. At the same time, we have to understand that many people who support the government, who are considered Chavistas, would not have turned out because they would know that this so-called referendum or plebiscite, which is not, as you said, not legal because it's unconstitutional, was called by the opposition, which means that the opposition would have done its utmost to make sure that they win this futile and shallow exercise in false democracy. We mustn't forget that in order to have validity for this kind of referenda, or for this kind of vote, there has to be submitted to the Electoral Commission, which was not involved in this exercise. So we're talking about a situation where the opposition claims to represent the majority of people, and they don't. I would like to quote Luis Vicente León. Luis Vicente León is the president of Data Analysis. Data Analysis is a pollster which is close to the government. And he himself said that this exercise was not valid, it had no validity, and therefore it was in many ways a Pyrrhic victory if the opposition has actually won this vote. So nothing is going to happen, nothing is going to change in Venezuela as a result of this, but many people will believe that because of this plebiscite, or whatever you want to call it, things are going to change in Venezuela. They have been deceived by an opposition that knows very well that this is a futile exercise in false democracy, because democracy has to be exercised, organized based on the Constitution and with the participation of the National Electoral Committee, which is supposed to be in charge of these events. We mustn't forget that the Assembly could have actually taken the initiative to call for a referendum. It is in the Constitution, it is their right, but it has to be submitted to the Electoral Commission for the Electoral Commission to organize it, not the way they have done it, in a very improvised way, and only 7 million people, assuming that is the number of people who turn up, only 7 million people have turned up. That means it shows that people are not prepared to play this in a way, silly game.
Well, the whole thing maybe could not have even taken place if the government wanted to, Jason Unruhe. Of course, we know that the way the government has dealt with these protests have tried to be in moderation. They've tried to uphold peace and security as much as they could, even though that there has been some deaths. At some point, President Nicolas Maduro said, "I'm calling on the opposition to return to peace, to respect the Constitution, to sit down and talk." He said, "Let's start a new round of talks, of dialogue for peace." This is what Maduro has said. But the opposition is not going with it. Why do you think the opposition does not want to even hold? It has held negotiations, but is not really open for dialogue on that front.
Well, the main reason that there is no dialogue is because I don't think it would make any difference. Where the whole situation in Venezuela is a very stark competition between the people of Venezuela, the legitimate government, and U.S. imperialism. There is no middle ground between the two. There are no concessions to be made from one side or the other. This isn't regular domestic politics where different parties get together and they make decisions based on mutually supported positions. This is U.S. imperialism directly interfering in Venezuela, and that is something that cannot be tolerated at all. This is something coming from a foreign power. This is an antagonistic contradiction, not one that can be solved by dispute. One side is completely correct and the other side is completely wrong. It's not like a normal political debate. The desires of both sides are completely diametrically opposed to each other. A middle ground by either side would make neither one of them happy. One wants to pursue a path towards socialism. The other wishes to return to the old ways of imperialist control over Venezuela. There can't be a middle ground between whether you're free or whether you're not.
I see you agreeing with him, if I understood your motions with your head correctly, Javier Farge. So is this a case of U.S. imperialism, as our guest from Ontario said?
Well, I am Peruvian, and I was living in Peru in 1973, just before the coup that brought down the government of the elected democratic government of President Salvador Allende. So I witnessed the way the whole thing collapsed. The pattern of behavior of the US in relation to what happened then is very similar to what's happening in Venezuela at the moment. They started by boycotting the economy. They're trying to squeeze the economy. In this particular case, in the case of Venezuela, to make the situation even worse because of the low prices of oil in the international markets. And as we know, most of the revenue that Venezuela gets from sort of export comes from oil. First, you try to crush the economy. Then you start exercising violence, and then you call and you provoke shortages. And of course, that provoked, in the case of reaction of the army, and we know what happened in September, on the 11th of September 1973. I saw it with my own eyes because I lived in Peru, where I come from. The pattern of behavior is very similar here. But there's a huge difference which the Americans or whoever, or the US, have not so foreseen. First of all, the army is on the side of the government, because President Chavez, when he took over in 1999, and he was re-elected several times, he involved the army in his own social project, which means that the army is very much on the side of the government. That's why one of the questions in this so-called plebiscite was calling the army to intervene in the political process in Venezuela, which was basically saying, can you please help us to have a coup d'etat, because we can't manage this by ourselves. So there is this element. All these people from the opposition, all these NGOs well funded by the US, are making the situation even more difficult. As our colleague said in Toronto, it's true, there is a middle ground, because the situation is so polarized at the moment that after the suspension of the negotiations of the talks in 2015, it's very difficult to find any common ground. There is the possibility, but on the other hand, those elements in Latin America who should have helped to provoke a dialogue between the opposition and the government. In this case, the OAS, the Organization of American States, they have taken sides with the opposition. So they are making it even more difficult for both sides to sit down and have a dialogue. And as our colleague said in Toronto, he's absolutely right. You have the legitimate government of President Maduro, and you have this illegitimate, unconstitutional, futile exercise in sort of vote, which makes the situation even worse, because what is going to happen now? Nothing is going to happen. The situation is going to remain the same as tense as it's been before after this referendum. But many people would have been deceived into the idea that this referendum or this plebiscite is going to change something. Nothing is going to change after this, and the elections for the Constituent Assembly on the 30th of July are going to happen anyway. And some people, like the former Attorney General Isaías Rodriguez, I'm quoting him, said, look, the opposition is wasting political capital. They could have taken part in the actual Constituent Assembly election, and they probably would have won it, but they've decided not to do that, and instead they decided to carry out this silly exercise in plebiscite, and things are not going to change after this.
Okay, so do you think then, Jason Unruhe, that there is a chance that the U.S. is somewhat involved with the opposition? Are they backing the opposition? And tell us what kind of interference you have seen when it comes to U.S. and Venezuela.
Oh, there is no doubt that the United States is standing firmly behind the opposition, if not outright giving them orders directly into their ear. This has been funded and controlled by the United States right from the beginning. And my colleague there is absolutely correct. That's the basic formulaic pattern that they use to try to overthrow any government that doesn't follow U.S. imperialist interests. We're seeing the same pattern repeated over and over again. A deliberate manipulation of oil prices, not just to harm Venezuela, but to harm Russia as well. But the primary victim here has been Venezuela. And continuing social unrest is absolutely being controlled by U.S.-backed opposition. Just recently, which was put out on a media outlet whose name escapes me for the moment, a former member of the opposition on the street level, the people who went out carrying out arsons and attacks on the police, said that the opposition was being not only funded by the United States, but they were specifically paying protesters cash, money, even giving them illegal drugs in order to go out and attack either peaceful pro-government protesters or to attack the police. And they say he found that when he was there, when he was operating on their behalf, that they were giving drugs to people and sending them to the front line in order to get killed. They were deliberately provoking the police and trying to get people on their side killed. And one of the ways they did that was to pump them full of drugs, these free drugs that were given to them. And this is absolutely unconscionable in any context. This is simply unacceptable coming from the opposition, which is getting its funding from the United States. I mean, it's impossible to deny at this point the overwhelming support that the U.S. government has given the opposition and has completely demonized the Maduro government, whose only real crime was giving free homes to people to lift Venezuelans out of poverty, etc.
We're going to talk about that in a minute, but you talked about the OAS, Javier Farja. Why is it that the OAS has not fully backed Maduro? I mean, were they influenced somehow by Western governments, in particular the U.S. maybe? What do you think?
Yes. Yes. Well, first of all, this is crucial here. The U.S. has been putting pressure on some member states of the OAS to go against Maduro. In this particular case, Mexico. Mexico has been at the forefront of this campaign against Maduro because of this issue of the wall. And President Peña Nieto, the Mexican president, has been trying to find a way to please the United States to avoid more conflicts and has been playing a crucial role in taking sides with the opposition. Second, they have to also try to manipulate all the right-wing countries in Latin America in order to make sure that they condemn President Maduro. Basically, the OAS these days is in many ways pointless and useless. The decline of the OAS is pretty clear at the moment. They don't have the strength and the power they used to have during the Cold War, because that's what it was created for during the Cold War, to be able to stop things. That's happening in the late 1990s when we have some major political crisis in Latin America. The OAS played no role whatsoever to solve them. In this particular case, the U.S. is putting pressure on some key countries. Canada is also responsible for this. The Council of Hemispheric Affairs, based in the United States, which is no friend of the government, has accused Prime Minister Trudeau of being an accomplice of this strategy against President Maduro. So the OAS, instead of trying to be kind of like a bridge between the opposition and the government to find some kind of a solution, they have taken sides with the opposition, and they have broken certain basic rules to try to get artificial majorities within the member states of the OAS to condemn the government of President Maduro. There's some videos that our viewers can actually watch on the internet, that you can see all this whole process of creating artificial majorities, trying to dismiss the presidency of Bolivia, for example, who were in charge of the OAS at the time of this debate, to be able to pass laws which were, to pass resolutions which were against the government of Venezuela. So the OAS is playing a clear game by the United States, and some key countries have been put under pressure. Caribbean countries, as well as Mexico, in this particular case Canada as well, have been playing key roles in order to be able to make the situation even worse. And they're breaking their own rules by creating, as I said to you, artificial majorities within the member states to create a climate of hostility towards Venezuela. The OAS is pointless, is useless, and no wonder why Venezuela wants to leave this organization that at this moment is making things worse rather than trying to help find some kind of compromise between the opposition and the government in Venezuela.
Well, doesn't that risk, Jason Unruhe, when Latin American countries are on the other side of Venezuela, not in support of this country, that they may also fall victim to U.S.'s offensiveness or influence? After all, we do know, I would think, that one of the major driving forces for the U.S. is Venezuela's oil, I would think, unless there's anything you want to add to that.
No, it's also access to markets as well, but overwhelmingly, yes, it is definitely about oil. But, sorry?
Go ahead. I wanted to find out why it is that these Latin American countries, are they not afraid that they may fall prey to the U.S. and its offensiveness, especially when it comes to the area of Latin America?
Well, definitely there is the risk there, but many of the countries that are standing against Venezuela are already underneath the jackboot of U.S. imperialism, or at the very least, very heavily influenced by them. That's the kind of the problem that Latin America faces, is that they really can only stand up to U.S. imperialism together. It is only through their unity that they would have the power necessary to oppose the United States. But unfortunately, the United States does manage to get its imperialist clause into many of the countries and then end up manipulating them, and that can almost have a domino-like effect. The struggle for Latin America is certainly an uphill battle, with the United States purposely throwing rocks on those trying to climb.
Well, I'd like to get your reaction on a quote based on what one person has said, and there's so many reactions that have come through. And basically, this person has said that our president, Chavez, supported the poor, the people. Today, we're following his legacy with President Nicolas Maduro. So do you think, Javier Farja, that that is the mindset of a lot of people in Venezuela, and therefore may defeat the opposition because of that mindset?
Yes. First of all, some right-wing media organizations have admitted that the Socialist Party, the Unified Socialist Party in Venezuela, is a formidable organization that has not been tested yet in its own entirety in relation to this situation in Venezuela. Second, I have visited myself. I have visited Venezuela. Last time was 2 months ago, so nobody can say I haven't been there, and I'm just speaking just for the comfort of London. And I have seen the social projects, the misiones, which have benefited many people. One of them being a huge housing project in the outskirts of Caracas, where land which was not used was expropriated, and blocks of flats were created for poor people. Many people have lost their homes after natural disasters. Just shortly after the opposition took over the National Assembly in 2015, they passed a law privatizing these blocks of these projects. That means that only the people who could afford to buy them were able to have them. So, and this is a pattern of behavior in the National Assembly to destroy every single achievement that the President Chavez accomplished in Venezuela. And the people will not let the opposition to go back to the old times. It's not, Venezuela has changed beyond recognition from 1999 when President Chavez was first elected. And the poor people who have benefited these misiones, I have seen, for example, factories where people work. They don't get subsidies or sort of easy money from the government. They work and sell produce to the state. Those people are not going to allow the opposition to privatize or to destroy those projects, because they are very much ingrained in the psyche of the Venezuelan people. So far, the majority of the Socialist Party and those people who have been benefiting from these misiones have not tested the opposition, but people won't let times to go back to before the time President Chavez was elected in 1999. That won't happen. We're
fresh out of time. Thank you very much for that. Let me thank first Jesus Silva, correspondent from Caracas, who spoke to us in the beginning. And you were listening to Javier Farja, Latin American affairs expert there from London, and also from Ontario, political commentator and analyst Jason Unruhe spoke to us. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Chavez, and the entire team in the capital, Tehran. It's goodbye.